In December 1943, at terror on Persia, the date for the liberation of the people of Europe was set on the Allied calendar of operations. Chosen to be Supreme Commander was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Destroy Hitler's empire, smash it by air, break it wide open, then invade by sea. That was the directive. The cross-channel assault was the crux of our plan. Early capture of a large port was of the utmost importance. Considered were Calais, Dieppe, Le Havre, Cherbourg, Brest. Cherbourg was selected. For more than one full year, there poured into Great Britain a torrent of war implements, tanks, guns, weapons beyond description. And men, American soldiers, at the rate of 150,000 every month. Assault training included every phase of the coming battle. In the early spring of 1944, joint maneuvers of the ground, sea, and air forces, which were to make the attack, were held along the southern coast of England. Every duty was performed as if this were the real thing. British shores, chosen for their similarity to the coastlines of the Normandy Peninsula, were the staging areas for these maneuvers. Meanwhile, the Allied strategic air assault on Fortress Europe went on with ever-mounting power. Day and night, the Allied air forces sent their bomb cargoes into the vitals of Hitler's self-proclaimed kingdom. Targets, factories, aerodromes, synthetic fuel plants, crude oil refineries, munitions works, railroads, canals, power plants. The climax of the air war came in February 1944, when the Luftwaffe made a desperate all-out effort to sweep our day bombers from the sky. The battle raged for a week. The cost to us was high, but the German Air Force came out of the battle crippled beyond redemption. Our attacks continued with unabated fury. At bivouac and training areas, ground troops received their alert orders. Men and equipment started to move. 65,000 men and 7,600 vehicles from bivouac areas all over Great Britain were moved to marshalling areas in southern England without a hitch. Highways were kept clear of all civilian traffic during this period. Rumor that the great invasion was at last underway flew through the length and breadth of Great Britain. In the marshalling area, each man drew a new gas mask of the latest type, an instantaneous life belt. Field rations were issued, including cigarettes and candy. When the men received French folding money, they knew what was what. Now special briefing officers took over. Each unit was briefed individually. The movement of the initial invasion task force from the marshalling areas to the embarkation points in southeastern England began on 30 May 1944. The timetable called for all troops, vehicles, and supplies to be aboard their transports within 5 days. This transportation and embarkation schedule, so vital to the whole invasion plan, required the closest possible coordination of times of departure and arrival. The operation was executed with expert skill and efficiency. Morale was high. Toughened, skilled, easy under discipline, our men knew they were ready. Embarkation of men and equipment took place simultaneously at 9 seaports along the southern and southwestern coast of England. All vehicles and tanks were loaded backwards on LSTs and LCIs. Concrete and cobblestone embarkation lanes known as hards had been constructed to speed loading. All vehicles embarked with gas tanks filled and sufficient extra gas for 150 miles. And the foot soldier was on time and in place. All English seashore towns through which our military forces passed were quarantined as a precaution against the leakage of information. Had the Luftwaffe commanded the skies at this juncture, it could have inflicted great damage to our men and ships, concentrated as they were in this relatively small area. Each man carried one K and one D ration. No extra clothing or barracks bags on this trip. General Eisenhower said of these men, "There is no question at all as to the readiness of the troops. They are well trained, fit, and impatient to get the job started and completed." These small assault boats ran a continuous shuttle service from the hards and docks to the transports lying at anchor in the harbor. This shuttling was a necessary expedient because of the huge amount of men and equipment that had to be loaded in a 4-day period and the limited dock facilities available in the ports of southeast England. But every factor in this vast transportation problem had been envisaged and worked out in advance. The arithmetic of logistics, however, could not have clicked without the spirit of frictionless teamwork which prevailed among the staffs and men of the Army and Navy. The job was everybody's job. Army, Navy, Air Force. As each ship was completely loaded with its men and equipment, it pulled out into the harbor to take its place in the forming convoy. Aboard ship, the men sweated out the hours of waiting, each in his own way. Naval gun crews received individual briefings. The success of this tremendous undertaking depended vitally upon the naval bombardment that would precede the assault of ground forces. Troop units rehearsed their objectives from D-Day to D+3. Everything known about the enemy's defenses was thoroughly analyzed by officers and men. Preventive maintenance service of arms and equipment was highly stressed in all branches of our military forces. An important problem was how to prevent guns and equipment from becoming fouled by salt water and sand. On 4 June, with the convoys fully loaded and ready to sail, the weather forecast for D-Day caused grave concern. A last-minute conference took place aboard the Augusta. D-Day was postponed 24 hours to 6 June. Airborne troops, the men who were to spearhead the invasion, had meanwhile been assembling at command departure points. These tough fighting men who were to drop behind the enemy's coastal defenses in parachutes and gliders had the extremely critical mission of preventing enemy counterattacks from upsetting the plan of our main assault forces. These airborne troops would be fighting the enemy and destroying his lines of communication 5 hours before the main assault forces hit the beaches. Covered by watchful air fighters, the American units left their various harbors in southeastern England to meet the British units at a rendezvous off the Isle of Wight. Our strategic air bombardment never let up. Through endless attacks on key bridges and rail centers, the ability of the enemy to shift reserves was fatally restricted. Under complete radio silence, each ship took its proper place in the vast armada. At twilight came the signal for the dash across the channel. At command departure points, gliders and their tow planes were standing ready for the night's operation. Speeds and altitudes were assigned to tow plane pilots, and glider pilots were given a final briefing on all that was known to our intelligence regarding the conditions likely to be found in the drop zones. Each unit's mission was clearly defined. Earlier in the day, General Gavin had a final talk with his men. General Eisenhower paid a visit to the airborne infantry. These men were assigned to 6 Pathfinder units. Takeoff, 2,310 hours of D-1. Time for the airborne spearhead to get going. At more than a dozen fields, paratroopers filed out of hangars on schedule and marched to their planes. Each combat team carried adequate equipment to complete its mission independently, for it was recognized that a night drop into heavily defended enemy territory by such large forces was bound to create a wild state of confusion on both sides. Parapacks of heavy equipment would be released separately. Gliders were loaded with equipment first. Each pilot checked his list of passengers. Paratroopers put on their full load of equipment, adjusting each item with extreme care. To hit the dirt just right with a full load of equipment is a highly specialized business. Final check by the jump master, the most particular man in the outfit. Paratroopers board their planes. Leg packs containing demolition supplies will be released by the men while in midair. Thus, each man will hit the dirt close to his pack. The success of the mission depended upon the rapid destruction of certain key enemy installations. The gliders take off. The heavily armed men in them, a short while before, had listened to a message from the Supreme Commander. You are about to embark on a great crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you, and the hopes and prayers of all liberty-loving people are with you. The vast convoy of seaborne assault forces stood deployed against 50 miles of French coastline. American forces were commanded by Lieutenant General Bradley. British and Canadian forces were under command of Lieutenant General Dempsey. Shattering the dawn 90 minutes before H hour, the naval bombardment opened up. It was like a convulsion of nature. More shell tonnage was expended in 1 hour than in the entire Allied naval campaigns of World War I. Each warship had its assigned targets, its individual schedule of fire. Prime targets were the enemy's powerful coastal guns. Infantry units that would comprise the second assault wave began transferring into their assault boats. The first assault wave was already standing by, waiting for the signal to dash inshore. The last phase of air bombardment began at 0530, 1 hour before touchdown of the ground troops. Streams of heavy, medium, light, and fighter bombers crossed the channel in the most intensive airstrike of the entire assault operation. Objective, to isolate the battle area until we could consolidate our beachheads and begin the breakthrough. The big guns poured it on. Combat teams, each on a schedule, continued their unloading into assault boats. There would be little time between the first assault wave and the second. Now the rocket ships opened up, smashing at underwater obstacles and coastal mines, over the heads of the first wave of assault troops, firing their massed salvos with close precision until the troops were 300 yards from the beaches. The fury from the air went on and on. Our airmen in tactical support of the ground forces took no rest that day. Back from one sortie, they gassed up, loaded their bombs and ammunition belts, and grimly went out again and again. The big guns raised their sights as the assault boats went in, and and smashed at the enemy's gun batteries farther inland. Yet so ingeniously fortified was this coastal zone that despite the deluge of bombs and shells from our air and sea bombardment, enemy counterfire was still effective as our men neared the beaches. Our first assault wave had a full share of heartbreaking misadventures. Many of their boats were hung up and wrecked on steel hedgehogs. Plunging fire from enemy batteries was extremely accurate. In the confusion, boats went astray or got out of control and crashed into one another. Forced to jump out of sinking boats, many men had to discard their weapons and equipment to save themselves from drowning. Casualties in the first hour were heavy. The British fired at fortified houses as they came in, smashing many a sniper's nest and observation post. In one American sector, fire from enemy pillboxes kept many of our men pinned against the shore cliffs. Our casualties were high. In the British sector, special duty engineers hit the beach first, with the medics and infantry following. With the beachhead secure, the infantrymen lost no time in driving on to other objectives. The second assault wave came in. In one American sector, enemy resistance was only sporadic and was quickly silenced. Our forces made substantial penetrations in the first hours. So it went on the beaches of Normandy this fateful day in June. Reinforcements continued to pour ashore. Artillery and heavy engineering equipment were firmly established. The German boast that an invading force could not remain ashore for 9 hours had been flung back on the now desperate defenders. Hitler's fortress had been cracked. The great gamble had been won, having accomplished what many European military leaders believed never could be done, a cross-channel invasion. The Allies were now in position to apply their great power to the methodical destruction of the German armed might, to bring retribution to the fiendish criminals that had conceived it, to scourge it and them from the face of the earth.
For a fateful period of time, history waits. Waits on tensed men trapped in the mud-soaked fields of Normandy until they are able to break out of that agony of isolation and move toward their destiny, changing history's course. This is that story. It is the story of breakout and pursuit.
The United States Army presents The Big Picture, an official report produced for the armed forces and the American people.
Hello, I'm Alexander Scorby. With its eye on the future, the United States Army is mindful of its past. It has a Department of History whose task it is to preserve that past, with all its glory and all its tragedy, with all of its wisdom and with all its failures. For more than a decade, this department, called the Office of the Chief of Military History, has been working on a project of epic proportions. the operations of the United States Army in World War II. More than 50 volumes in this series have already been published. It will total 80 or more when it's completed. The most recent is Breakout and Pursuit by Martin Blumenson. Its subject is what happened on the continent of Europe in July and August of 1944, 2 crucial months that will light the fire of memory in American minds. Or perhaps not in all minds. Time moves swiftly, and in its headlong rush, it condenses the events behind us. One magic and memorable day, we were across the English Channel, our feet at last on the Normandy beaches. Soon after, we were lighting the skies of liberated Paris. And perhaps only those who were there, or whose lives were changed by what happened there, remember that 80 days of war and its uncertainty lay between the two events. This book is a sweeping record of those days. It's a big book, both in size and in scope. Heroes crowd its pages, the ones whose names became carved on the consciousness of the world, and the obscure ones who held the final hope of triumph in their 2 hands and in their hearts. It's a book with a happy ending, for it tells of a great victory, or series of victories. But it's not so much concerned with victory itself as with the structure on which victory rested. The decisions, the agonizing waiting, the frustrations, the bold hopes, the daring executions, the errors and the logic, from all of which together victory ultimately came. Here's the situation as the book and the action begin. United States and British and Canadian troops on the 1st of July 1944 were engaged in battle with German forces on the Channel coast of France. The cross-channel attack, beginning on the 6th of June, had accomplished the first phase of the invasion. The second phase called for the Allies to expand their foothold. They needed space to maneuver, room to handle the large amounts of men and materiel streaming over from England. Before they undertook the decisive attack toward the heart of Germany, they wanted this area. But 3 weeks after the invasion, they had only this tiny beachhead, the British here and the Americans here. The greatest single disappointment of the invasion had been the inability to take Caen, which blocked the approaches to the Seine. But the British troops attempting to capture the city had been thwarted. The best hope now lay in the ability of the American forces to strike south and then west and take the key ports in the province of Brittany. A major impediment to this course of action was the terrain the troops would have to fight through. Marshy land enclosed into thousands of separate little fields by hedgerows, behind every one of which it seemed the Germans were well entrenched. And what of these Germans who faced the Allies in the soggy fields of Normandy? They were disheartened, certainly, by the success of the Allied landings. Moreover, the German people were exhausted after 5 years of war and with the effort of fighting on 5 fronts. But the troops themselves were far from beaten. They were skillful, tough troops, seasoned by experience. Their discipline was sharp. Their morale was high. The Germans had a new weapon, the deadly B-1, a small pilotless jet aircraft which had begun to fall on England in the middle of June. A supersonic B-2, even more devastating than the B-1, was almost ready for operational use. These weapons gave the Germans hope of redressing their discouraging situation. Adolf Hitler was himself directing the war. Believing that eventually the Germans would be able to launch a large-scale offensive which would drive the Allies from the continent, he planned in the meantime to pin them down in Normandy and prevent them from using their mobile power. Although some of his commanders now recommended limited withdrawals to make their defensive positions stronger, Hitler refused. To withdraw for any reason at this time seemed to him to admit defeat. So, as American forces prepared to strike across the hedge-rowed lowland where the Germans had erected strong defenses, Hitler announced that those defenses were to be held. The American attack began in the dawn hours of July 3rd, and it lasted for 17 rain-soaked, agonizing days. The soggy hedge-road terrain immobilized the mechanized power of the ground forces. Slow, painful advance was measured in yards, a hedgerow at a time. Like the steady rain which fell over the entire operation, a sense of despair and frustration touched all those who participated. The last action in this offensive was the battle for Saint-Lô. The Allies wanted Saint-Lô for a number of reasons. Its prestige value, the effect its capture would have on the Germans, and as an access to roads leading south. After a week of bitter fighting, they got it. The cost was high, as was true in all the hedgerow fighting, but the town was secured, and in the process, a memorial was created. An infantry battalion commander killed before the gates of the city was carried into Saint-Lô with the liberators. His body was placed on a pile of rubble, an impromptu shrine to the qualities of courage and sacrifice that had made the drive to Saint-Lô possible. The triumph belonged to the dead as well as to the living. The results of this July offensive were disappointing. The greatest gain had been only 7 miles. The need was urgent for a way to break out of the containment of the Normandy situation, to get onto flat, dry land so that the Army's mobile force could be unleashed. General Omar Bradley, commander of the American troops, had been forming a plan for some time. Bradley's plan, which was codenamed Cobra, was to gather together an overwhelming concentration of ground troops, twice as great a force as would normally be used on such a narrow front, and combine it with a massive assault from the air by the Army Air Force. In war, heavy bombers are used primarily for strategic purposes, to knock out major long-range targets such as railheads and manufacturing plants deep in enemy territory. To use heavy bombers for tactical reasons, that is, to help the ground forces obtain an immediate objective, was quite risky. Mainly because of 2 factors. The heavy bombs dropped from the big planes created craters and debris, which became serious obstacles to the ground troops. And Because our own forces would have to move far back from the front to escape the damage of the bombers, the time interval between the air bombardment and the ground forces' attack on the target was too long. It gave the enemy time to recover and marshal his defenses. Bradley thought that in this case, he could eliminate many of these dangers, if not all the risks. No plan in war is foolproof. But this one was bold, and if it worked, it would enable the Allies to break the stalemate in which they'd become bogged down. Brittany was still the eventual goal. The first step toward it would be the line between Coutances and Caumont. Between the end of the earlier July offensive and the launching of Cobra, there was a lull for about 1 week. For the weary American troops, it was a welcome respite, a time to relax. On July 20th, a dramatic event electrified the world and revealed that there was no relaxation inside the enemy camp. Hitler himself announced that a cabal of high-ranking army officers had tried to assassinate him with a bomb in order to seize political power. The abortive coup had little effect on the military situation. It revealed no widespread discontent with Nazi rule among the armed forces. The combat soldier was too busy simply trying to remain alive. And the information about the German situation which the Allies wanted, as Cobra neared its jump-off date, was of a considerably more immediate nature. Did the enemy have enough reserves available to counter the attack? Was the Luftwaffe capable of intervening? And finally, would the Germans employ the V1 or V2 or some other secret weapon? These were the questions that haunted the Allied camp as it waited to unleash Cobra. July 24th was the day scheduled for the attack. Because the day was heavily overcast, however, with inadequate visibility for air attack, the operation was postponed. Unfortunately, the postponement order reached the English air bases too late to hold back all the planes scheduled for the attack. The bombardment from the planes which did not receive the postponement order was not great enough to damage German positions seriously. But it was sufficient to alert them to the threat of a ground attack. And German artillery gave American forward units a hard time for the rest of that day. For General Bradley, an immediate and urgent decision had to be made. The prospects were improving for good weather the next day. Should Cobra be launched, even in the face of the possibility that the Americans had now lost the important element of tactical surprise? Or should it be postponed at least for several days, which might then give the Germans a chance to prepare even stronger defenses? Bradley's decision. Cobra would strike again at 11 o'clock the next day. Again on the morning of July 25th, the planes came. One observer called the seemingly endless waves of planes the most imposing aerial parade I have seen since the beginning of this long war. they dropped more than 4,000 tons of destruction. But the tactical effect was not immediately clear. Did the bomber attack destroy the efficiency of the German troops? No one could tell. General J. Lawton Collins, 7th Corps commander, who was to spearhead the attack, had little time to ponder the question. For better or for worse, Cobra was launched. The troops moved out at once. Their immediate objectives were the towns of Marigny and Saint-Gilles. Capture of those towns by the infantry would give the Americans control of the roads leading south, and Collins would then be able to catapult his mobile armored forces forward. It seemed reasonable to assume that if the air bombardment had destroyed the German defenses, the infantry troops would be able to reach and secure their objectives without great difficulty. To their surprise, they met strong resistance. At the end of the first day of the attack, Marigny and Saint-Gilles were still in enemy hands. Because the entire success of Cobra depended on a 7th Corps breakthrough, Collins decided to gamble. It would prove to be one of the fateful decisions of the campaign. He pondered the possibilities and the risks and decided to put his armor into action. Paid off. In mid-afternoon of the 26th, one armored column, having cracked the enemy's defenses around the town, rolled through Saint-Gilles. There was no longer any doubt. The German line had definitely been penetrated. The 7th Corps had achieved its breakthrough. But the drama of the breakthrough did not end at the Coutances-Caumont line. The drama lay in the development of the breakthrough into a breakout of major proportions. The decision to accomplish this was General Bradley's. He had achieved the limited victory he had sought. Cobra had been a success. He could stop now. But he sensed from their disorganized reaction that a deep wound had been inflicted on the Germans. The Americans pressed their attack through rapidly crumbling German defenses. By the end of the month, United States forces stood at the base of the peninsula, at the gates of the province of Brittany. And a nightmarish phase of the battle, the war of stalemate, was over. Cobra and its exploitation were among the most solid accomplishments of the war. Let's visit now with the man who more than any other was responsible for this achievement, General Omar Bradley. General Bradley, as you look back on Operation Cobra, what seems to you to be the real secret of its success?
I think several factors were very important in contributing to our success. First, as always, the aggressiveness and the fighting spirit of the American soldier. Second, the marvelous teamwork displayed by the combat armies and our Air Force. And third, the magnificent alertness of my subordinate commanders and their ability to take advantage of the breaks. In particular, General Collins' bold move.
This book must be like traveling down an old and familiar path to you, General Bradley.
Well, it is, yes. But it's more like traveling down a road in the daylight that at the time you had to take it was in the dark. It's generally familiar, but it's always interesting to see the whole picture, part of which was hidden before.
You think the book throws light, then, on this period of history?
Most effectively. It does an excellent job, I think, of cutting through the dust which that campaign kicked up and letting the reader see what happened and how it happened and why.
Well, one of these days, when the Army historians get through with their project, they'll have the what and how and why of the entire war caught between these binders.
It's about as ambitious a task as any group of historians has ever undertaken, I suppose, and quite a valuable one. A much better job than has ever been done on any other war.
You mean valuable in the sense that we learn from the past?
That most of all, of course. Despite the fact that the weapons of war are changing, the principles of war remain the same. Officers studying these volumes can learn much about command, tactics, strategy, the tyranny of logistics, the problems of terrain, the importance of reconnaissance. There are many lessons to be learned, but it's not only the military man who will benefit from these books. The war was a big thing in all our lives. We've been reading about the Revolution and the Civil War for a long time to get a clearer picture of ourselves as a nation. The Army is giving us the ability to do that now with the greatest war we ever fought in our history.
Thank you very much, General Bradley. Operation Cobra, of course, is only one action in the crowded and historic 2 months which Breakout and Pursuit reviews. Much of the subsequent action was more colorful, but Cobra was the key which unlocked the door to those spectacular victories. The reaching of Avranches signified the culmination of the breakthrough and the point at which our forces split for the westward and eastward drives in the Breakout. To the west, there was the dash across Brittany, where the ports of Saint-Malo and Brest finally became prizes of conquest. To the east, there was the repulse of the German counterattack at Mortain, where the American infantrymen withstood the onslaught of 4 German armored divisions and turned back Hitler's attempt to halt the Allied mobile column. The trap the Allies closed at Argenton and Falaise, where they virtually destroyed 2 German field armies. The drive east to the Seine River, climaxed by the liberation of Paris, when the civilized world thrilled to a symphony of joy and delight. The flowers, the kisses, the song, and the wine. And finally, the triumphant and dramatic pursuit of the retreating Germans beyond the Seine to the border of the enemy's homeland, and the Siegfried line, where a new phase of the war awaited. And thus the epic weeks ended. The short span of time in which the shape of final victory began to emerge, with the successful breakout from the hedgerow country and the pursuit across the heart of France.
The Big Picture is an official report for the armed forces and the American people. Produced by the Army Pictorial Center. Presented by the Department of the Army in cooperation with this station.
Paris, the most coveted city in history. Since its beginnings 2,000 years ago, Paris has drawn to it lovers of beauty, of learning, and of liberty. Scholars, churchmen, artists, those who have given us our civilization, and those who have tried to take it from us. In 1940, sounds of the storm of war again drew close. In Paris, we listened. But we felt the storm strike at our spirit. Paris was spared, but we were left to shed our tears for the fall of France. The spirit of Paris appeared crushed. But in 1944, it rose again to prove its claim to life with honor.
Each dawn is a new beginning for us who have lived in Paris all of our lives. For us who live here from day to day, it is more than a city. It is a way of life. It is a meeting every day of the present with our sometimes glorious, yes, and sometimes bitter past. It is civilization, Paris is. It is a spirit each day reborn in 3 million lives that makes us one. But each of us, we have our own vitality and purpose, our own pride and individuality. Beautiful? Mais oui. Never are we too busy to stop and see how beautiful Paris is. Its cathedrals that celebrate the long history of our faith, arches that celebrate our victories, buildings of dedication to the arts, but it is our lives around these buildings these monuments, that makes them live. It is the love of learning, not the buildings of our Latin Quarter, that celebrates wisdom. It is we, the people, not the stones, that are Paris. The beauty of Paris, alors, what really does it celebrate but the dignity of human life? And our triumphal arches, but the dignity of man.
The dignity of human life, the dignity of man. Ah, we learned again their meaning and their cost. We learned again that summer of 1940, seeing them crushed before our eyes. Loyalty, sacrifice, devotion, those Paris has inspired always. But envy it has inspired too, and greed. May we every passion of man Paris has inspired and survived. Did not for centuries Paris fight wolves in its streets at night to serve the day as the center of culture? Now to us again her streets cried out.
1940, I wouldn't forget it, that march on Paris in June. It was hot and dusty, but a happy march. Why? Because we were young. In this city, Paris, we have heard of it all of our lives, like a beautiful woman. And now, she was going to be ours. But with empty streets, Paris welcomed us. Yeah, but was this not better than guns? After a year of war, after the cities we had found necessary to destroy in Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium, now to take Paris unharmed, even the Führer himself, we heard, thought the war was over. But this war, it had only begun. For the 4 years while it would last, we must occupy Paris to keep France under military rule. He who holds Paris holds France. It is the center of all transportation and communication and administration of the whole country. The city we held, but the people, the way they behaved to us, sometimes we were not quite so certain. But what could they do, the French, with no army left? That is war. The soldier obeys orders. To occupy so charming a city, of course, these orders were not hard to obey. For even our officers, I think, military discipline sometimes left their minds. Yes, and war too. Was it not all agreed Paris was an open city?
In the Paris underground, we had the headquarters of the French forces of the interior. With the Gaullists, the Maquis, the Communists, we had all worked against the Nazi occupation. We had few weapons, only sabotage, and always the threat of reprisals. Now at last we could prepare for our parts in the liberation as the Allied armies swept toward us to Normandy in 1944.
Here it was mid-August, and we'd been slugging our way ever since we hit the Normandy beaches in June. Up ahead somewhere was Paris, but it didn't look like we'd be lucky enough to see it. Our goal was Berlin, and we heard the plan was to isolate Paris and bypass it. In fact, right now you could hear our planes going up again to cut the city off. Barely 100 miles from Paris when we'd clobbered the Nazi 7th Army at Argentan. We were still kind of wishing we were going on into Paris, but there wouldn't be much left to see there if the Nazis defended it like they had this town. It was when we got a chance to stop and sample French hospitality, or sit down for a few minutes with a cigarette, that we talked about what we'd like to do in Paris and what it would look like if we ever did see it. Would Notre Dame look like this? Or would it look like the picture of the cathedral we'd all seen on a million Christmas cards? And would it all be as beautiful at night? We knew Paris was really blacked out, but we'd heard it called the City of Light, and that's still the way we pictured it. Blacked out, in our imaginations, Paris still sparkled like a string of jewels. But out here in Normandy, the sparkles we saw were real.
The soft life at Paris, it was gone. Now we were ordered to get our tanks and equipment outside the city, between Paris and this Allied advance that was already smashing our 7th Army to the west. How could we defend Paris against full-scale attack? We were barely 20,000 men, we would have no reserves. But to the last man, the Führer ordered Paris defended. The soldier obeys orders. In the outskirts, south and west of Paris, we took our positions and we waited.
For us now in Paris, the city was like a bomb with the fuse lighted. As the Nazis withdrew to their defenses in the outskirts, we mobilized the resistance openly. The Allied armies were now so close. What held them back from us? Could the rumor be true that they might pass us by completely? We had no alternative. We must take Paris ourselves. We seized ministries, newspapers. We forced a truce with the Nazis. We paralyzed the city. And we waited.
By now, some of us were right up within spitting distance of Paris. We still had a war to win, but we began to hear that Paris was falling anyhow. We even heard that de Gaulle now wasn't as worried about the Nazis as trouble from the different factions in the resistance movement trying to take over. So our top brass decided it would be better to take Paris than to have a civil war at our backs, and that de Gaulle would have his wish, that French troops would be the first ones to enter. The French 2nd Armored Division, under General Leclerc, was instructed to move on Paris from Argentan immediately. In the small towns around Paris, there were rumors and confusion wherever we went. The French were tearing down roadblocks so we could get through, and we heard that Paris had already been liberated by the resistance forces. We heard the Nazis had already signed an armistice and just wanted to get out of town in one piece. Anyhow, General Giraud showed up with our 1st Army's 5th Corps to back up the French advance. When the French troops themselves showed up, so many of them had GI uniforms and equipment that things looked even more confusing. They didn't expect to meet much opposition.
Now came the Führer's order. Paris must not fall into the hands of the enemy except as a field of ruins. The Seine bridges he ordered prepared for demolition. But we who were outside the city, what if we must retreat back through Paris? Now they came. We were waiting.
about the Nazis, the ones who had shown us the meaning of terror. What had happened to them? Were they so badly off now that they must send children to do the work of men?
Childhood? For some of us, there had never been one. There had only been war.
And for France, must death make men of boys too? They came closer to Paris, but so slowly it seemed. Now we learn that Leclerc was slowed not only by the enemy. Each step nearer to us, tumultuous welcomes delayed his troops. Outside Paris, at the town of Rambouillet, they were engulfed.
Well, the French launched their new advance the next day. If ever the world was waiting for the sunrise, it was that morning. But there was rain, then drizzle, and more rumors. The latest was that the Nazis had mined the Paris sewers and were ready to blow up the bridges. Finally, all that was real was blood and gunfire.
But it came out not like we had planned. We, professional soldiers, being herded like cattle down village streets by country farmers.
In Paris we waited, but with elation now, not fear.
The resistance movement, the French forces of the interior. We were an underground no longer. Yes, to the barricades. In that cry is the history of Paris.
The stones of the streets, they came to life in our hands.
Already stained with French blood, these stones, torn from the walls of the Bastille in the Revolution. Yes, and always they have risen in the barricades where the people of Paris meet their oppressors at last. Now, this morning of August, we heard history singing in our blood.
Before our eyes, it was really happening. Our city, Paris, being liberated. Oh, the confusion of history when it is being made, that we could see but a corner of it before it was pulled away into the past. Such confusion. Were not those our soldiers inside the American uniforms? Like all history, it took its price. Yes, the price from those who expected to pay it. But a price, too, from us who could fight for Paris only in our heart.
And the highest price from those who became part of our history forever.
Now to end it, to destroy these reminders of our humiliation, to set Paris in order again. Paris and France.
We crossed the Seine River that morning, and when we came into Paris, we could hardly believe it was real. Really Paris, here all in one piece. And the people in it still alive. They sure were. And here it was, when we hit the center of town around noon. Our Christmas card in August, Notre Dame.
In the Montparnasse railroad station, a command post was set up by General Leclerc. Now he prepared to go and receive the Nazi surrender.
General-Lieutenant Dietrich von Choltitz, our commander. Why did they give him no honor of a full military surrender? No, they did not understand. They did not know what he had done, but I think he had saved Paris. Von Choltitz had disobeyed orders. He could not defend Paris, no, but he left it no field of ruins. Our commander, like us, I think, he loved Paris too much to destroy it.
There were surrenders going on wherever you looked. Prisoners were being rounded up all over town. Our own Fifth Corps took over 10,000, and still they came on.
Well, these the same streets where just yesterday we had commanded. And were these the French people we had so quietly lived here beside for 4 years? All this time had it been burning inside them, this fury and humiliation they poured on us today.
After 4 years, de Gaulle. For us, all this time, he had been France away from France. Now again, he was a part of us. The streets and the squares, Paris filled them for his welcome. To de Gaulle, we could look for order, to make Paris and France one again. But still hidden among us were our enemies, enemies of the people, enemies of law and order. Communists, fascists, criminals. In 4 years, the Nazi occupation had bred a disease of hatred and greed in desperate men. Spirits rotted by collaboration, by dreams of power. Now we woke them in a hurry.
Paris belonged to the French again, all right. They turned the city upside down with victory, and you couldn't escape their gratitude, their excitement, even if you wanted to. It was victory with a sharp taste. Or a sweet taste, depending. And the next day they had a parade, right through the middle of Paris. The enemy was hardly outside the city. Nazi holdouts and snipers were still hidden all over town, but nobody seemed to care. Why, they packed the streets.
Yes, this parade, we were warned it was dangerous. De Gaulle himself, he knew this. But the danger, that was why we must have the parade. These loyalties to France, they had been scattered for 4 years. Now we wanted only to show that order had returned, that free France stood again as one. Some, they had fought not for free France, but for power, for themselves. Now still they hope to profit from chaos. When the parade reached Notre Dame, again there was gunfire. But de Gaulle, he had only disdain for these enemies. This courage, yes, we would follow it anywhere. Napoleon was right, bien sûr, when he said that we French have vanity, levity, independence, and caprice, with an unconquerable passion for glory. We would as soon do without bread as without glory.
We had a parade ourselves a couple of days later, but it wasn't really much of a celebration for us. We still had a man-sized war going on right outside of town. We paraded through Paris in combat formation because the streets were still so jammed that a parade was the only way we could get through town, to pick up the war on the other side. A glimpse of a familiar building or a monument from the corner of an eye, and before we knew it, we were through it. That was all the look at Paris some of us ever had.
Now Paris was more like Paris. There was little fuel for cars, so we rode bicycles. Oh, many things we lacked still, but very soon our allies started sending us the food we so desperately needed. How grateful to them we were, how secure we felt now to see their supreme commander himself in our streets. Now again, Paris could go about its business. The Nazi occupation was history, another chapter in the past that is always a part of Paris. The pleasure of being alive again. Like most women, I imagine, I showed it with a new chapeau. After 4 years, Paris at peace.
Peace. But tears must be shed for those who helped win it, like these 27 members of the resistance, buried together with a single funeral. While on the roads leading from Paris, these Nazi dead, tears, they had won nothing for anyone. Outside Paris, history swept on, leaving behind it the past to seek something familiar, the future something new.
Past and future, to us now war looked the same anywhere. We drove on across France, across Belgium, toward the German border. In the Ardennes Forest, we met a new enemy. Winter days passed without dawns or sunsets. Days as alike as the trees around us, as alike as the roads we followed. They were days as alike as the faces of the prisoners we took, passing in endless lines like the endless weeks of that winter. But with the spring in Germany, we found a new kind of prisoner, the French prisoners of war that we liberated, to start their long trek home.
And once more, Paris waited.
To France they came back, 1 million, more than 1 million men, and to Paris. Paris, she had shed tears of humility, of loss. Now her tears, they were of gratitude for the return of her son.